In this video, I'm coming around to answering question 3 from the Reconstruction chapter readings. This question asked, why did Reconstruction ultimately fail? As I see, there are 3 main reasons for this. The first is white resistance. White terror organizations were set up to intimidate black voters and intimidate white Republican voters into staying away from the polls. This helped to reimpose white rule in the South. As well as voter intimidation, they also attacked symbols of African American self-achievement, such as educational establishments, etc. Anything which showed that African Americans were on the rise was resented as a threat to white supremacy. By the end of Reconstruction, by the mid-1870s, Democrat, white-dominated governments were being re-established in the South, the beginning of a long period of Jim Crow rule, which ended only with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. The second reason was that African Americans lacked economic resources. Towards the end of the war, when slavery was falling apart rather than being officially ended by government action, Grant was promising former slaves 40 acres of land. This promise, which was popularized as 40 acres and a mule, that is enough land to feed yourself and to live on and a mule to work it, became a key demand or a key expectation or hope of former slaves. But this was never fulfilled by the federal government. Redistribution of land was one step too far, even for radical Republicans. They wanted equal rights and citizenship. They had, for African Americans, however, they had no intention of entering into dangerously socialistic practices, such as taking land away and giving it to former slaves. Without this economic independence, African Americans were far more vulnerable to the other kind of pressures being put on them in the attempt to re-establish white domination. And thirdly, Northern Republicans rather lost interest in the issue of Reconstruction. Their attention began to turn to other issues in the North, and the South was forgotten about. The Grant administration was notoriously corrupt, and many Republicans broke from the party over this issue. For example, Horace Greeley, who was a newspaper editor in New York, had been a leading supporter of Lincoln and a leading opponent of slavery, but he began to make common cause with Democrats in criticizing the corruption of the Grant administration. And events in the far off South ceased to be of great interest to what Northerners saw as more pressing political concerns. So by 1877, after the disputed 1876 election, the last federal troops were removed from the South, so there was no force in place to resist the re-establishment of white supremacy by the Klan and other white supremacist armed organizations. It's often said, although my understanding is that this is not fully proven, but it's often said that the deal which ended the deadlock over the 1876 election was that the Republican candidate was to be allowed to become president in return for dropping Reconstruction.